She was beaten for birthing daughters, until the widowed cowboy said, "Then let me raise them proud." Mara had learned to keep her cries silent. Every time she bore a daughter, her husband's rage fell on her like a storm. He told her she was cursed, that her womb was too weak to give him a son. The bruises darkened her skin, but the deeper wounds lived inside her. Each time she wrapped a newborn girl to her chest, she braced for his fists, not his embrace. Her daughters grew up quiet, sensing the danger in every slammed door, in every muttered word. One winter, when the sickness came through the valley, it took the man who had tormented them. The women of the town whispered that Mara must feel relief, but grief is never so simple. She had been beaten down for so long that freedom felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, wind in her face, ground uncertain beneath her feet. Her girls clung to her skirts, hungry not only for food but for something steady, something safe. She had no money, no land, and no one to speak for her. It was then that Eli rode into their lives. He was a cowboy weathered by loss, his hat shading a face cut deep with lines of sorrow. His wife had died years before, and the ranch had been silent since. He had no children to carry his name, no laughter in his halls. When he heard the way Mara and her girls had been treated, he looked at them with a quiet fire in his eyes, not pity, but recognition. He knew what it was to be broken and left behind. At first Mara resisted him. She did not trust men, not even those who spoke gentle words. But Eli didn't press. He came by with sacks of flour, with boots for the girls, with his hands ready to mend a fence or haul water. When the eldest child, Anna, asked him shyly why he bothered, he tipped his hat and said, "Because you're worth raising proud." It was the first time the girl had ever heard a man speak her value without asking anything in return. Mara watched him, and slowly, she began to see. Eli didn't just feed them. He taught the girls how to ride horses, how to rope cattle, how to sit tall in a saddle as though the land itself had chosen them. He didn't soften their strength, he sharpened it. When the youngest stumbled trying to brand a calf, Eli clapped her shoulder and said, "Every scar you earn is proof you stood up to the work." Mara's heart ached with a new kind of pain, the pain of realizing what her daughters could have been allowed to become all along. The girls, once shadowed and timid, began to carry themselves differently. Their laughter returned, ringing across Eli's ranch. They stood straighter, eyes brighter, voices louder. Mara, too, found her steps steadier, as if every kindness Eli gave her children stitched together something inside her. She had lived under fists that tried to erase her, but now she watched her daughters grow into women who could not be erased. And through it all, Eli never claimed them as his own possession. He only claimed the duty to help them rise. When neighbors whispered about impropriety, about what a widowed cowboy wanted with a broken woman and her brood of girls, he simply said, "I want them to know they're more than enough." And somehow, in that promise, Mara discovered a truth she had never been allowed to believe, that birthing daughters was never a curse, but the beginning of a legacy worth riding tall for. Mara lay awake in the small cabin that Eli had helped repair, the sound of the wind scratching along the wood as if the world outside tested the strength of their shelter. Her daughters slept close by, curled together like fox kits, warm in the pile of quilts Eli had brought over from his own place. She could see their little faces, softened by sleep, no trace of the fear that once haunted them. That absence was what allowed her chest to rise and fall more steadily now, but rest still came fitful. She had lived too long expecting footsteps in the dark, too long believing love was nothing more than a fist disguised as duty. Trusting the quiet was harder than surviving the storms. Eli had said he would check the livestock before dawn, but she knew he would stop by again. He always did, not for any reason he announced, but because he seemed to need the sight of them as much as they needed his presence. His kindness unsettled her sometimes. It was like sunlight pouring into a room shuttered for years. She kept asking herself when it would burn, when it would prove itself a trick. But day after day, Eli gave no sign of cruelty. He spoke less than most men, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, yet in every word there was weight, a kind of steadiness Mara had never known. One morning, as the frost still clung to the grass and the girls hurried to gather eggs, Eli led Anna out to the barnyard. Mara watched from the doorway, heart tight. Anna was tall for her age, almost 13, her hair wild as a tumbleweed, her eyes carrying the same quiet that Mara had learned to wear. Eli handed her the reins of his old roan mare. The girl hesitated, glancing at her mother, but Eli said, "She's yours today. You don't just ride her, you led her." Anna's hands trembled, but she mounted. The horse shifted, tested her balance, and Anna sat firm. Eli didn't take control, didn't reach for the reins when the mare jerked. Instead he stood back, arms folded, eyes calm. "She'll test you, girl. Let her know who you are." And Mara watched her daughter, who had always shrunk under the weight of her father's scorn, draw herself taller in the saddle and whisper commands with a strength she didn't know she had. When Anna rode out across the pasture, the cold air tugging her hair, a cry of laughter broke from her lips, high and free. Mara pressed her hands to her face, not to hide tears but to feel them, to know they were real. Over the weeks, each of the daughters had their moment. Ruth, with her quiet determination, learned to mend fences alongside Eli, her small hands steady with wire and hammer. Lydia, the youngest, tried and failed to lasso calves until her arms ached, but Eli never let her give up. "A miss is just a step toward a hit," he told her. And when she finally looped a calf's hind legs, she whooped so loudly the chickens scattered, and Eli's chuckle carried like gravel rolling down a hill. Mara saw her girls blooming, but what startled her most was how they pulled her into their laughter. Once, they had kept joy hidden from her, afraid it would draw anger. Now, they dragged her out into the pasture, thrusting reins into her hands, daring her to ride again as she had when she was a girl. She resisted, saying her back was too stiff, her bones too weary, but Eli's steady gaze from the fence post told her he believed otherwise. Against her own fear, she swung up into the saddle, and though her thighs screamed with the effort, something inside her felt 10 years lighter. In those rides, Mara began to feel the shape of a life she had thought forever lost. The town that once looked at her with pity now watched her daughters with admiration. Neighbors nodded to Eli, tipping their hats, some whispering about his charity, others about his foolishness, but Eli never answered gossip. He worked, he taught, he kept his promises. That was his answer, but not all hearts in the town were softening. One afternoon, as Mara carried flour back from the general store, a woman named Clara intercepted her on the boardwalk. Clara's voice dripped with sweetness sharp enough to cut. "I hear Eli's spending more time with you and your girls than folks think proper. You might be setting a dangerous example, Mara. Men don't give without expecting something in return." Mara's jaw tightened. The old shame threatened to creep back, whispering that Clara was right, that kindness always carried a hidden cost. But before she could reply, Eli's shadow fell across the boards. He had come up quiet, as he often did, and his eyes cut to Clara with a calm that held more steel than anger. "The only dangerous example," he said, "is teaching children that their worth depends on a man's conditions. These girls don't owe me anything. They stand tall on their own." Clara's lips pinched, and she turned away, muttering about impropriety. Mara stood frozen, not from fear, but from the shock of being defended in public without ridicule. Eli looked at her then, as if waiting to see whether she would shrink back. Instead, she lifted her chin, a small gesture but one that carried the weight of years. Back at the cabin, the girls crowded around, asking what had happened. Mara didn't give them Clara's words. Instead, she told them what Eli had said, word for word, and watched their eyes widen. Anna whispered, "He thinks we're enough." Mara touched her daughter's cheek. "He knows you're more than enough." The days stretched into months, and each season left its mark. Spring brought lambing, and the girls spent nights in the barn, giggling between the cries of ewes. Summer's heat blistered the earth, but Eli taught them to find shade, to work steady instead of fast. Autumn filled their hands with harvest, baskets heavy with apples and squash, and Eli showed them how to store food for the hard months ahead. Winter returned, but this time the cold carried no dread. The cabin glowed with firelight, with laughter, with the sound of stories told instead of screams. Yet healing was not without shadows. Mara sometimes woke in the night, heart racing, certain she'd hear her late husband's boots on the floor. She'd reach for the girls, needing to touch their warm bodies, to remind herself they were safe. Eli never intruded on those moments, but she knew he saw the hollows under her eyes. One evening, he set a mug of coffee before her and said quietly, "A wound that deep takes time. Don't rush it, let it scar the way it needs to." Mara stared at him, stunned by the permission in his words. No one had ever told her it was all right to carry pain. She realized then that Eli wasn't trying to erase her past. He was helping her build on top of it, stronger than before. The girls, too, carried their own ghosts. Sometimes Anna grew restless, her eyes sharp with questions she didn't voice. Sometimes Ruth grew angry at small things, her temper flaring like sparks. Sometimes Lydia cried at night, clinging to Mara and whispering fears that someone would take Eli away. Mara didn't always know how to answer, but Eli did. He told Anna, "Questions make you brave, not weak." He told Ruth, "Your fire's a gift if you learn where to throw it." He told Lydia, "No one can take away what's real." One summer afternoon, a storm tore across the valley, ripping branches from trees and scattering cattle across the hills. Eli, Mara, and the girls rode out together, chasing the herd through sheets of rain. The sky cracked with lightning, but not one of them faltered. Mara felt the thunder under her bones, felt the weight of fear pressing, yet she also felt something else. Her daughters, fierce and determined at her side, their voices rising over the storm. For the first time in her life, she rode not as a victim of circumstance, but as part of a family that had chosen one another. When they finally gathered the cattle and returned soaked to the bone, Eli built a fire, and the girls tumbled laughing into the warmth. Mara sat across from him, water dripping from her hair, and for a long moment their eyes held. She didn't need to speak to know he felt the same truth she did, that love was not always born of blood or vows, but of the steady work of showing up, day after day, without demand. It was that storm, Mara later thought, that sealed something unspoken between them. From then on, when Eli's hand brushed hers as they worked, she didn't flinch. When he spoke of the future, she didn't hear it as a dream for himself alone. And when the girls called out to him, "Pa, come see," Mara didn't correct them. She only smiled, her heart full, knowing that her daughters had found a father who taught them to ride tall, to laugh loud, to carry their worth like a banner across the wide, open sky. As the weeks passed after that storm, Mara found herself catching moments where the world seemed almost too still, as if it were waiting for her to believe in peace. She would stand at the edge of the pasture, skirts whipping in the wind, and watch the girls ride with Eli, their laughter carried high. The sound filled the air like birdsong, something she once thought would never return to her life. Yet even as joy spread through her days, she wrestled with a shadow that whispered she didn't deserve it, that at any moment it could be torn away. One evening, while the sun sank low and spilled orange fire across the fields, Eli came to her with a question. "You ever thought about the land here?" he asked, his eyes scanning the horizon. She frowned. "What do you mean?" He gestured with his chin. "This cabin, this field, it could be yours outright. I got enough acres, more than I can work alone. We could deed it in your name, in the girls' names. Something that no man could ever take from you again." Mara felt the words sink into her bones. Land in her name. It was a kind of security she had never imagined. But fear rose, sharp as a thorn. And what would people say about that? About you giving away what's yours? Eli turned, his eyes steady. "They already talk. Let them. Your daughters need roots, not rumors." She didn't answer right away. That night, she lay awake again, listening to her daughters breathe, and thought of the years they had lived like tumbleweeds, pushed and scattered by a man's temper, never knowing where they belonged. Roots. The word echoed in her chest, both heavy and freeing. A few days later, she found Anna in the barn, brushing down the roan mare. Anna's movements were confident now, her hands sure, but her eyes carried something unspoken. Mara leaned against the stall door. "You're quiet today." Anna shrugged, not meeting her gaze. "The kids in town, they say things. About us. About Eli." Mara's heart clenched. "What do they say?" Anna's lips twisted. "That we're charity. That we don't belong." Mara stepped forward, touching her daughter's arm. "Do you feel like charity?" Anna shook her head fiercely. "No. He treats us like we matter." Mara nodded, her throat tight. "Then you remember that belonging doesn't come from their mouths. It comes from how we stand." Anna studied her mother, then whispered, "Sometimes I forget how strong you are." Mara smiled, though tears burned her eyes. "Sometimes I forget too. That's why we keep reminding each other." The weight of gossip did not vanish, but Eli seemed determined to drown it out with work and with presence. He taught Ruth to shoot a rifle, her small hand steady as he guided her aim. "Protection isn't just for men," he told her. Ruth beamed with pride when her shot split the target, and Mara saw in her eyes the light of a girl who would never cower again. Lydia, meanwhile, developed a gift for caring for the animals. Eli began calling her the little doctor, and she would puff her chest with pride, declaring that no calf or lamb would suffer on her watch. One crisp autumn morning, as frost still lingered on the fence posts, Mara found herself standing with Eli by the creek. The water moved slow, reflecting the pale sky. "Why do you do this?" she asked suddenly, the question spilling from her before she could stop it. "Why give so much to us?" Eli didn't answer right away. He pulled a stone from the bank and skipped it across the water, the ripples spreading wide. "I lost my wife before we had the chance for children," he said finally, voice low. "I thought the house would always be empty, the land too big for just one man. When I saw you and the girls, I saw more than sorrow. I saw a chance to fill the silence, to make something right." He glanced at her. "Not because you owed me anything. Because I needed to give, and you needed to be free." The honesty in his words shook her. She realized then that Eli's giving wasn't about ownership, it was about healing something inside himself as well. Two broken pieces had found each other, and somehow they fit. As winter settled in again, their small family grew even tighter. Nights were spent by the fire, Eli telling stories from his younger days on cattle drives, the girls giggling and interrupting with questions. Mara found her voice, too, telling tales her own mother had once whispered by lamplight, stories she had buried deep under years of silence. To her surprise, Eli listened with the same respect he gave the girls, as though her words mattered just as much as his. It made her feel whole in ways she could not name. But with the snow also came challenges. Supplies grew thin when a blizzard trapped them for days, and Eli fell ill with fever. For the first time, Mara and the girls had to take charge of the ranch alone. They hauled water, fed the animals, chopped wood through frozen air that burned their lungs. Mara tended Eli, sponging his brow, whispering prayers she wasn't sure anyone heard. Anna took the lead outside, her voice steady as she directed her sisters. Ruth hunted rabbits with the rifle, her hands shaking but her aim true. Lydia cared for the smaller animals, wrapping them in old blankets to keep them alive through the cold. Mara watched them all, her heart bursting with a mix of fear and pride. These girls, once hidden in corners, now stood like pillars against the storm. When Eli's fever finally broke, he found the cabin warm, the animals fed, and Mara sitting by his side with exhaustion etched deep into her face. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but certain. "You don't need me half as much as I need you," he whispered. "We all need each other. That's the only way this works." By spring, Eli was strong again, and the thaw brought new life to the ranch. One day, a traveling preacher rode through, offering to bless homes and families. The girls begged for him to stop at their cabin. Mara hesitated, fearing the judgment that might come, but Eli agreed. When the preacher asked what he should pray over, Eli said simply, "Pray for these girls to grow into women who never doubt their worth." The preacher bowed his head, and Mara felt tears streak down her face. For once, a man's words over her daughters were not demands or curses, but blessings. As the years passed, the bond between them all deepened. Anna grew into a young woman, her strength matched by a quiet wisdom that reminded Mara of herself. Ruth became fiery and bold, never afraid to speak her mind, while Lydia's gentle hands and steady heart earned her a reputation for healing creatures across the valley. Mara, once bowed by shame, walked into town with her daughters beside her and her head held high. People still whispered, but whispers could not undo the pride in their steps. Eli never asked Mara for promises she wasn't ready to give. But one summer evening, as they sat together watching the girls race across the pasture, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, a man's touch carried no weight of fear, only the quiet strength of a vow unspoken. She turned her palm into his, fingers intertwining, and felt something settle inside her, something that had been restless for too long. The ranch became not just Eli's, but theirs. The girls grew under his guidance, but also under Mara's resilience. Together they built a life where daughters were not curses, but crowns. And Mara, who had once been beaten for bringing them into the world, now watched them rise with fire in their eyes, standing proud on the land that was finally, undeniably, their own. The years moved in ways both slow and startling. Mara often found herself measuring time not in seasons, but in the ways her daughters changed. Anna's shoulders grew straighter, her stride more deliberate, her laughter carrying a confidence that once would have seemed impossible. Ruth's voice sharpened into clarity, her opinion strong enough to silence runes. Lydia's hands became deft with care, her touch known in the valley for saving lambs and calming colts. Mara, who had once felt every step tethered to the lash of a cruel man's anger, now felt those same steps carrying her further into a life she had not dared to imagine. Still, shadows sometimes lingered. There were days when Mara awoke and reached instinctively for bruises that no longer existed, days when whispers in town cut sharper than she expected, days when fear stirred in her daughter's eyes after a raised voice on the street. The past could not be erased, but it could be rewritten, line by line, with each act of tenderness, each day of survival turned into more than survival. Eli seemed to know this instinctively. He did not rush them forward nor pretend the past had never happened. Instead, he built layer upon layer of trust until it became a foundation strong enough to bear the weight of memory. One spring afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a fence line, Anna asked a question that startled them all. "Eli, if we'd been boys, would you have treated us different?" Her tone was curious, not accusing, but it stopped Mara in her tracks. Eli looked up from the post he was hammering, sweat streaking his brow, and studied her. "I don't reckon so," he said slowly. "I don't see daughters as less, if that's what you mean. Work's the same, courage is the same. I reckon what matters is how you stand, not what you're born as." Anna tilted her head, considering. Mara held her breath, waiting to see if the words would land. Then Anna smiled, a quick flash of teeth, and turned back to her task. Mara felt relief wash over her, not because Eli had said the right thing, but because her daughter had asked at all. That question meant she trusted herself to seek truth instead of burying doubt. That was new, and it was everything. The valley, however, was not always as forgiving as the walls of their cabin. When Ruth turned 16, a young ranch hand from town began to follow her with eyes that lingered too long. Mara caught it one day when they visited the store. The boy leaned against the post, smirking as Ruth passed. "Pretty girl," he called, "bet you can't do half what your pa does." Ruth spun on her heel, her fire blazing. "I can do twice what you do, and I don't need to be called pretty to matter." The boy flushed, muttering, and slunk away. Mara's chest swelled with pride, but also with a flicker of fear. She knew too well how men responded when their power was challenged. Eli, when told of the incident, only nodded. "She's got to learn to stand her ground," he said. "But she's not standing alone. No one in this valley will mistake her worth again." The next week, he took Ruth out with him to drive cattle, letting her ride point, the most dangerous position. Mara worried, but when they returned, dust-coated and weary, Ruth's grin was so wide Mara couldn't find words to scold. Meanwhile, Lydia, still the youngest, began to attract attention of a different kind. Word spread that she had a gift with animals, that she could calm even the wildest colts, heal wounds that others thought hopeless. Farmers brought her their sickly lambs, and she worked beside Mara with herbs and bandages. Once, a neighbor sneered that such work was wasted on a girl, but when Lydia's poultice saved an entire litter of piglets, that same neighbor returned with gratitude in his eyes. Mara saw in her youngest not only gentleness but a kind of authority that demanded respect without needing to shout. Through all of this, Eli remained a steady center. He was aging now, his beard streaked with gray, his movements slower than before, but his presence was unwavering. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Mara found him sitting on the porch, hat in his hands. "I never thought I'd live to see a family like this," he said quietly. "Thought I was meant to walk out this life alone." Mara sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "You weren't meant to be alone," she whispered. "None of us were." Their silence stretched long and comfortable, and for Mara, that silence was more precious than any declaration. But peace was always tested. One autumn, a drought struck the valley. Grass shriveled, rivers thinned, and cattle grew restless with hunger. The ranchers gathered to discuss solutions, but some turned their eyes toward Eli and Mara, muttering about how much land and livestock Eli kept for a family that, in their words, wasn't truly his. Mara overheard one evening as she walked past the saloon. A man ought to leave his spread to blood, not strays, a rancher spat. The words sliced her, reopening old wounds she thought long scarred. That night, she sat at the table, her hands trembling around her cup. Eli noticed, of course. Tell me, he said, and so she did. She repeated every word she'd heard, her voice tight with anger and fear. Eli's eyes darkened, but his voice stayed calm. Blood don't make a family. Choice does. I chose you, and I'll keep choosing you. They can't take that away. The next morning, Eli hitched the wagon and took Mara and the girls into town. He walked straight to the land office, hat in hand, and declared, I want every acre I own signed into joint deed with Mara and her daughters. This land is theirs as much as mine. The clerk blinked, stunned, but Eli's tone brooked no argument. Word spread fast, and tongues wagged even faster. Some called him a fool. But when Mara stepped out of that office holding the deed in her hands, her name inked bold beside his, she felt a weight lift from her chest that had pressed there for decades. For the first time in her life, she owned more than her pain. She owned her place. Years turned, and the girls became women. Anna married a kind rancher from 2 valleys over, a man who admired her strength rather than feared it. At the wedding, Mara watched her daughter walk tall down the aisle, her smile fierce, and felt pride sharper than tears. Ruth refused marriage for many years, choosing instead to run cattle with Eli, her fire fueling the work. Maybe I'll marry, she said with a grin, when I find someone who can ride as hard as me. Lydia grew into her gift, becoming known throughout the region as a healer not only of animals but of people, her hands steady in sickness, her presence soothing even the hardest hearts. Mara aged, her hair silvering, but her spirit grew younger with every year her daughters thrived. She often sat on the porch, watching them return from the fields, and thought of the woman she once was, the woman beaten for birthing daughters. That woman seemed like a ghost now, distant and fading, but Mara never let herself forget her. That memory was the measure of her gratitude, the reminder of how far they had come. Eli's health declined with time, but his pride in the girls never wavered. On his final spring, he gathered them all close and said, You've been the sons I never had, and better. You've been my family. Don't let this land, or this name, or this life ever make you think you're less than proud. When he passed, it was with their hands on his, the cabin filled with the warmth of fire and the echo of all he had built with them. Grief came like a river, but it did not sweep them under. Mara and her daughters stood firm, shoulders squared, and carried his lessons into every corner of their lives. When neighbors came offering help, they accepted with grace but never with dependence. When whispers rose again, they drowned them out with laughter, with work, with proof of their worth. And so the story of Mara, once beaten for birthing daughters, became a story told across the valley in hushed tones of awe. Mothers whispered it to their children, daughters clung to it as proof of their value, and men who once scorned found themselves silenced by the undeniable strength of a family raised not by blood, but by choice, by love, and by the steady hand of a widowed cowboy who had said, Let me raise them proud. After Eli was laid to rest on the hill overlooking the ranch, where the wildflowers bloomed each spring, Mara found herself waking before dawn as she had in the old days. She would sit by the window with a shawl around her shoulders, watching the first threads of light climb across the horizon. The ranch was quiet without his voice, without his steady boots moving across the porch, but it did not feel empty. It carried his presence in every fence post, in every hoofprint pressed into the soil, in every laugh the girls let loose across the yard. Anna had moved with her husband to his spread, but she returned often, her wagon loaded with supplies and her arms full of children who tumbled out onto the porch with squeals. Her eldest, a boy named James, would run straight to Mara, climbing into her lap despite being nearly too big for it. Tell me a story, Grandma, he'd beg, and Mara would smile, brushing his hair back. She told him the old tales of hardship and hope, never hiding the darkness but always showing how the light had come through. She wanted her grandchildren to know that strength was not just in muscle or work but in surviving, in standing when others tried to push you down. Ruth, true to her spirit, remained on the ranch. She rode harder than any hand they hired, her hat tilted back, her grin as fierce as the sun. Suitors came and went, some daunted by her fire, others trying to tame it. She sent them all away. "If I marry," she said one evening as she and Mara shelled peas by the fire, "it'll be because someone sees me as I am, not as they want me to be." Mara only smiled. "Then you hold out, girl. You don't settle for less than proud." Lydia's gift grew into something larger than any of them expected. People began riding from 3, even 4 valleys away, bringing sick children, wounded men, and animals on the brink of death. She never turned anyone away. Mara often watched her youngest bend over a fevered child, her brow furrowed, her hands steady, her voice gentle as she murmured words of comfort. It reminded Mara of Eli's steadiness, of his way of making people feel safe just by being near. Sometimes, when she saw Lydia work, she felt as though Eli's spirit had passed into her, guiding her hands. Mara's own body aged, her bones aching more with each season, but her spirit felt lighter than it ever had. She had thought once that survival was the best she could give her daughters, but now she saw something greater, a legacy. They were women of strength, women who could shape not only their own futures but those of the children and neighbors around them. That was what Eli had meant when he spoke of raising them proud. Yet pride did not mean the world grew easy. The valley faced hardship after hardship, storms that tore down barns, sickness that spread through cattle, droughts that cracked the soil. Each time, the family bore the weight together. When Anna's husband fell ill one winter and could no longer work his land, Ruth drove her cattle to Anna's pasture, feeding 2 herds as though it were nothing. When Lydia exhausted herself healing others during an epidemic, Mara sat beside her bed, holding her hand, whispering prayers over her fever until she recovered. When marauders rode through one spring, stealing horses and threatening farms, it was James, Anna's boy now grown, who rode out with Ruth and others to track them down, returning not only with their horses but with a reputation that the family would not be intimidated. Mara sometimes wondered if Eli was watching from that hill, seeing how his choice to stand with them had blossomed into something so much larger. She often spoke to him as though he were, telling him of each triumph, each sorrow. "They're strong, Eli," she'd murmur as she laid flowers on his grave. "Stronger than I ever dreamed they could be. You'd be proud." And in those moments, she felt as though the wind itself answered, carrying the scent of sage and earth across the ranch. Anna's children grew, and with them came a new chapter. James became a rancher in his own right, strong and steady, but it was his sister, Clara, who startled the valley. She was quick with numbers, quicker with words, and soon began managing not just her father's spread but offering advice to other ranchers. Men scoffed at first, refusing to take instruction from a girl barely grown, but when her calculations saved 3 families from ruin during a drought, their laughter turned to respect. Mara saw in Clara the spark of herself, the sharpness that had once been beaten down but was now given space to thrive. Ruth, though she had once claimed she might never marry, met a man named Daniel, a blacksmith's son who came to the valley to find work. He was tall, with arms strong from the forge, but what caught Ruth was not his strength but his patience. He never flinched when she argued, never tried to quiet her fire. Instead, he listened, smiled, and sometimes even laughed. Mara saw the change in her daughter's eyes, the softening that came when someone saw her fully. When Ruth finally brought him to the ranch, Mara studied him long and hard. He met her gaze without arrogance, without fear, only with quiet steadiness. Later that night, Mara told Ruth, "He doesn't want to tame you." Ruth grinned. "No, he wants to ride beside me." Lydia, too, found a companion, though not in the way her sisters did. She never married, but she formed bonds with countless families who saw her as kin. Children she healed ran to her when they saw her in town, calling her Aunt Lydia. Farmers left gifts on her porch, not as payment but as gratitude. She became a kind of legend, known not just for her healing but for the way she carried herself, with humility, with grace, with a power that made people believe in something greater than themselves. Mara aged into her 70s, then her 80s, each year more precious than the last. Her hands grew frail, her steps slow, but her voice carried weight. Neighbors came to her for counsel, children curled at her feet for stories, her daughters leaning in to hear her wisdom. Sometimes she thought of the woman she had been, beaten for birthing daughters, and she marveled at the distance between then and now. She had been told once that daughters were a curse. Yet here they stood. Daughters who built legacies, who healed, who taught, who raised the next generation strong. One summer evening, Mara sat on the porch, wrapped in a quilt, watching the sun sink low. The air buzzed with cicadas, the smell of fresh hay drifting. Around her, grandchildren and great-grandchildren laughed, Ruth's fiery voice cutting through the noise, Lydia's calm presence grounding it, Anna's steady warmth holding it together. Mara closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. It was the sound of everything she had fought for, everything Eli had given them space to become. When she opened her eyes again, she whispered into the twilight, "They are proud, Eli. Just as you promised." And the wind carried her words across the valley, as though delivering them to the hill where he rested, ensuring that the legacy they had built together would never fade. The years moved, as years always do, with both haste and patience. Mara's life had spanned eras of grief and triumph, and when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, it was not in silence but surrounded by the sound of voices she loved. Her daughters were with her, their hands steady around hers, her grandchildren gathered in the corners of the room, the youngest clutching the hem of Lydia's skirt, too young to understand but old enough to sense the weight of the moment. Mara left the world as she had once entered it, with breath that trembled, with the burden of pain, but this time her departure carried no shame, no fear. It carried legacy. Her passing became more than a private sorrow, it became a turning point for the valley. People came from miles away to stand at her grave, to honor the woman whose story had spread beyond her cabin walls. They whispered of how she had once been beaten for bearing daughters, and how those daughters had risen to stand taller than any curse. They spoke of Eli too, the widowed cowboy who had said, "Then let me raise them proud." Between them, a new kind of story had been written, one that would not be forgotten. After Mara's death, her daughters felt her absence in different ways. Anna, ever steady, carried on with her husband and her children, but she visited the hill often, bringing her own grandchildren to sit in the grass and listen as she told them of the grandmother who had given them their place. Ruth poured her grief into work, her hands blistering from the reins, her voice sharp as ever. Lydia carried it quietly, her healing touch now laced with a new depth of tenderness. It was Clara, Anna's daughter, who first began to speak of building something greater in Mara's honor. One evening, as the family gathered around the fire, Clara's sharp eyes flickered in the flames. "We should start a school," she said suddenly. The room stilled. "A school for girls. Grandma spent her life proving that daughters aren't curses. We should teach them to read, to count, to lead. If we want her story to last, we make sure no girl in this valley ever feels small again." The words hung in the air, bold and impossible, yet undeniably right. Ruth leaned back, skeptical. Who's going to fund that? Who's going to send their girls when most men think schooling's wasted on them? Clara's jaw set, much like Mara's once had. "We will. And they'll come. Maybe not at first, but they'll come. You'll see." And so it began, with Ruth's cattle profits, Lydia's healing reputation, and Anna's careful management. They pulled what they had and built a small wooden structure near the creek, painting it white, filling it with benches and books. The first season, only 3 girls attended, 2 from nearby farms and 1 from the edge of town. But by the next year, word had spread, and a dozen came. Clara taught them reading and sums, but more than that, she taught them stories. The story of Mara, the story of Eli, the story of women and men who chose differently than the world expected. Some fathers resisted, sneering that their daughters belonged in kitchens, not classrooms. But when those same daughters learned to manage accounts, to track herds, to heal sick animals, their families could not deny the value. Slowly, resistance turned to pride. And slowly, the school became more than a classroom, it became a place of transformation. Ruth often rode by the school in the afternoons, dismounting to lean in the doorway and watch the girls recite their lessons. She never stayed long, but her presence was like a shield. Lydia visited often too, teaching the girls about herbs, about care for the body, about how gentleness could be as strong as steel. Anna sent books from her husband's library, volumes that once seemed too precious to touch now held by small eager hands. Mara's name began to spread further still. Travelers who stopped at the ranch or the school carried her story to other valleys, and soon girls from far beyond came seeking lessons. Some rode days, others boarded with families nearby. By the time Clara turned 30, the little school had grown into something larger, a community of learning that carried the spirit of a woman who had once been told her daughters were curses. But legacies are never without challenge. With success came envy. A group of men in town, unsettled by the growing influence of educated women, tried to shut the school down. They claimed it disrupted the order of things, that it threatened families, that it was unnatural. One evening, they gathered at the saloon, loud with drink, and declared they would tear the school down. Word reached Ruth before they could act. That night, she rode into town with Clara and Lydia, their presence silent but powerful. Ruth's hand rested on the butt of her rifle, Clara's eyes burned with fire, and Lydia's calm voice carried further than shouting. "This school stands because my grandmother stood," Lydia said to the crowd. "You call it unnatural. What's unnatural is beating women for giving life. What's unnatural is telling daughters they are worthless. If you tear down these walls, we'll build them again, and again, and again. You can't unteach what's been learned." The men grumbled, some muttering threats, but none moved. Perhaps it was Ruth's hand near the rifle, perhaps it was Lydia's calm, perhaps it was Clara's fierce certainty. Whatever it was, the school remained standing. And with every season that followed, more families sent their daughters, until opposition grew smaller and smaller, drowned out by the undeniable truth. The girls learned, and the valley prospered. As years turned into decades, Mara's great-grandchildren carried the torch higher. James, Anna's son, became known for his fairness in ranching, treating workers with respect and standing against those who exploited them. Clara expanded the school into what she called an academy, adding classes in science, history, and trade. Ruth and Daniel's children grew up fearless, inheriting their mother's fire, riding as hard and working as fiercely as any man. Lydia's influence spread across counties, her name synonymous with healing. Families spoke of her as though she carried the touch of angels, though she always brushed such talk aside. And still, through every change, Mara's grave on the hill became a place of pilgrimage. Children came with flowers, women came with prayers, men came with silence. Some left tokens, pieces of ribbon, sketches of their daughters, letters folded tight. The hill became more than a resting place, it became a testament. Clara often brought her students there, sitting them in the grass, telling them the full story. She did not soften the cruelty of Mara's first husband, nor the bruises she bore. She told it plain, because the truth carried power. She was beaten for birthing daughters, Clara would say, but those daughters were the beginning of everything you see here. Remember that when anyone tells you that you are less. The girls would sit, wide-eyed, the wildflowers brushing their skirts, and they would carry that story home, spreading it further still. Time marched on, and the valley itself changed. Railroads came, towns grew, machines replaced some of the work once done by hand. But through it all, the ranch stood, the academy thrived, and Mara's name remained woven into the fabric of the place. Her daughters, her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, they all lived with the same unshakable truth. Worth was not given by men's judgment, nor taken by their scorn. It was carried, lived, proven day by day. On the 100th anniversary of Mara's birth, the academy held a gathering. Families from across the region came, filling the valley with voices and laughter. A plaque was unveiled, carved in stone, with the words, "To Mara, who bore daughters and bore the weight of a world that tried to break her. To Eli, who chose to raise them proud. To the daughters who became women, and the women who became legacy. May every girl know her worth, and may every son honor it." As the crowd stood in silence before the plaque, the wind swept across the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers. And those who listened closely swore they heard laughter in the breeze, the laughter of daughters once hidden, now risen, now carried forward into a world that would never again be able to call them curses. The century mark passed, then another half-decade. The academy grew from a single schoolhouse into a cluster of buildings with wide porches and tall windows, filled with girls and boys alike who carried notebooks instead of pails, who learned to question as much as they learned to labor. The ranch remained the anchor of it all, still held by Ruth's descendants, still worked by strong hands and steady horses, though modern machines now shared the burden. The hill where Mara and Eli rested became not only a place of remembrance but a landmark, a site where weddings were blessed, where vows were spoken, where girls and boys climbed to shout their dreams into the valley below. Through it all, the story was told and retold, how Mara had been beaten for birthing daughters, how Eli had said, "Then let me raise them proud." It was not written in books at first, only carried in voices, passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son, from teacher to pupil. But when Clara's students grew and became teachers themselves, some began to write. Pages filled with words, pamphlets spread, and eventually books carried Mara's name far beyond the valley. Historians called her life a parable of defiance, feminists called her a pioneer, and ranchers called her one of their own. But to her family, she was still simply mother and grandmother, the woman who had given them roots deeper than any drought could dry. Generations turned again. The ranch passed from Ruth's line to her grandchildren, who modernized it without erasing its bones. Lydia's name became attached to a hospital in the nearest town, her healing remembered long after her hands had gone still. Anna's quiet steadiness bore fruit in descendants who became leaders in councils and communities, guiding not with fire but with patience. Claris Academy eventually bore her own name, and later, Mara's, carved in stone above wide doors that welcomed children from across the state. But history is not kind to every era. Wars touched the valley, pulling away sons and daughters. Economic hardship swept in waves, testing the academy, testing the ranch. New voices rose against old ones, demanding progress, resisting change, reshaping the land again and again. Yet always, when people faltered, the story was returned to like a well. Mara and Eli, daughters and pride. It was in the 3rd century after her birth that Mara's great-great-granddaughter, Eliza, found herself walking the hill one autumn evening. Eliza was not a rancher, nor a healer, nor even a teacher. She was a lawyer, one of the first in her state to argue cases of equal pay for women, to stand against laws that limited their rights. Some called her reckless, others radical. But she, like those before her, carried fire in her bones. She knelt at the grave, brushing away fallen leaves, her hand steady on the stone. "They still don't see us, Grandma," she whispered. "They still want us quiet, small, grateful. But I won't, I can't, because of you." Her voice broke, but her back did not bend. "Every time they call me too much, I think of you being told you were not enough. And I know I am exactly as I should be." The wind stirred around her, cool and certain. She closed her eyes and felt, as her mother and her grandmother had before her, that she was not alone on that hill. The story had become her marrow. Years later, when Eliza stood in the highest court of the land, her voice echoing off marble walls, she carried Mara with her. She spoke of equality, of dignity, of justice, not only in legal terms but in human ones. And when she finished, when the chamber fell silent, she thought of her ancestor who once could not even speak her pain aloud, and she felt the chain between them stretch unbroken. The ruling that followed did not fix everything. It never could, but it cracked open another door. And Eliza returned to the valley, exhausted, triumphant, kneeling once more at the hill. "We're not finished," she said into the earth. "But we are further." The valley itself continued to evolve. The academy became a university. The ranch became both heritage site and working land, teaching visitors what it meant to live from soil and sweat. Every year, on the anniversary of Mara's birth, families gathered on the hill, not in mourning but in celebration. Girls and boys stood together, reading her story aloud, letting their voices braid with the wind. By the time 3 centuries had passed since her first cry entered the world, the valley bore little resemblance to the one she had known. The old trails had become paved roads, the cattle herd smaller, the academy larger. Technology threaded through everything, yet on the ranch, the rhythm of hooves still beat steady against the ground. And through it all, the memory of Mara and Eli endured, not fossilized in stone but alive in living blood, in choices, in defiance, in love. One final generation brought the story full circle. A girl named Mara Rose, with eyes like Ruth's fire and Lydia's calm, stood at the academy podium to deliver her graduation speech. She was 17, fierce in her certainty, her voice carrying across the courtyard where hundreds sat gathered. "My great-great-great-grandmother was told she was cursed for birthing daughters," Mara Rose began. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, though many already knew the tale. She was beaten for bringing life, punished for giving the world what it did not value. But she endured, and a widowed cowboy chose to see her daughters not as shame but as pride. That choice changed everything. It made me possible. It made us possible. I stand here because of them. Because of every woman who refused to shrink, every man who chose to stand beside instead of above, every child who listened and carried the story further. We are not curses. We are not shame. We are not less. We are proud. Her words rang out, fierce as thunder, soft as prayer. When she finished, silence held for a heartbeat, then applause broke, rolling like a storm across the courtyard. In that sound was not only approval but recognition, of Mara's pain, of Eli's defiance, of daughters and sons raised with pride instead of fear. That night, Mara Rose walked the hill. The air smelled of wildflowers, just as it always had. She knelt between the two graves, laying a ribbon across the stone. "I will carry it forward," she whispered. "Your story is not ending. Not here. Not ever." And the wind moved as it always had, sweeping through the valley, carrying her vow into the night. For the story was not only Mara's, nor Eli's, nor their daughters. It belonged to every voice that rose after, every child who learned, every hand that healed, every heart that refused to bow. It was a story written in bruises and blossoms, in tears and laughter, in defiance and tenderness. It was a story of what happens when one woman refuses to vanish and one man chooses to honor her instead of break her. It was the story of a legacy built not on power or wealth but on dignity, on pride, on love that defied the world's cruelty. And though centuries would pass, though names and faces would change, that story would echo as long as wind moved across the hill, as long as daughters were born, as long as sons remembered, as long as anyone anywhere chose to raise them proud. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.